Hello. Hi, Jimmy here with my new cat friend who has just scampered away. He's been scared off by a dog. And we're going to discuss something that I haven't really discussed on the channel yet, which is weapons. I did that video about Damascus steel and that kind of went down quite well. And I suddenly realised after 3 years of doing history and reenactment on YouTube, I should do a video that at least involves weapons in some way. But first I'm going to square up my background a little bit. There we go. According to my camera, I am level, but it's... yeah, that's as good as we're going to get. I am next to Bailey Hill, so I'm not on flat ground. There's this trope, there's this idea, this legend that the Vikings preferred axes to swords, that your average Viking warrior would rather be using an axe than a sword. And that's obviously a very loaded question. So what truth is there in it? What do we actually have from the archaeology and from the history that suggests that this might be the case? So the thing about axes is they're not just weapons. An axe is also a tool, right? A sword is a sword is a sword. If you have a sword, you have a weapon. If you have an axe, it doesn't necessarily follow that you have a weapon. You might be talking about the axe that you as a woodsman use to fell trees or prune trees or split logs or chop firewood, or even do some of the finer woodworking involved in making a longboat or a ship. Axes come in many shapes and in many forms. You only need to go to the Museum of the Tool down in France to have a look at this amazing array of axes that they've got there. And axes are something that would have been an everyday sight, right? Whether you live in a city like York or London or Constantinople, or you live in the countryside, you live on a farmstead, you live on your own, an axe would be an everyday sight because everybody needed wood for their fire, for their hearth, and axes were an essential tool. So it's highly likely that the vast majority of the adult male population of Europe had access to or owned an axe of some kind, whether that's a specialist tool for woodworking or woodsmanship, or that is a little hatchet that they use to chop up bits of wood for the fire. You've probably got access to an axe, and that's borne out in the archaeology. We've got hundreds of axes from the Viking Age. In Great Britain alone, we've got about 75 axes datable to the Viking Age, and they go from being these great big 11th century style broad axe blades to little tiny hatchets. And that variety of blades has been found in the River Thames. All sorts of axes have been found in the Thames for whatever reason. They were in a boat, the boat sank, somebody fell into the river, they threw it in anger, they were chucked in for some kind of offering. Whatever the reason, we've got lots of axes of various different types. In terms of swords from Great Britain, I think we've got about 150 swords from the Viking Age. So in those terms, swords are more common than axes. In Norway, we've got 2,500 plus swords from the Viking Age. That's a hell of a lot of an artifact that's meant to be rare. Like everywhere you go, you'll read the sword was a rare, expensive weapon. And yet we've got 2,500 surviving swords. That's not all the swords that were made. I don't know how many axes we've actually got from Norway. I've tried to have a look and I couldn't find the info. If any archaeologists from Norway can provide us the numbers of axe finds, that would be wonderful. I'm not familiar enough with the artifact and find databases of Norway to be able to do a proper search, so I apologise. But by way of comparison, in Denmark we've got about 115 axes from various site types. 98 of those are from graves. Just over 100 of the swords from Denmark are grave finds. So again, swords and axes found in sort of similar numbers in Denmark. On the Isle of Man, on the other hand, we've got 14, I think, swords and about 80 axes. So like a lot of axes compared to swords on the Isle of Man. So all of these numbers where I'm throwing them at you, where we've got more axes than swords or more swords than axes, they don't really mean anything because it's 1,000 years since they were put in the ground. And they can tell us a great deal. They can tell us about the person that was buried. They can tell us, combined with the other artifacts in the grave, about maybe how wealthy they were or what sort of standing they had in society. Things like the mammon axe can tell us when the axe was made, when the haft was made, because the tree that was felled was dendrochronologically dated to 971, so we know exactly when that tree was chopped down. And all that's fantastic. It doesn't tell us if that situation now was the situation 1,000 years ago. For example, we have 75 axes from the Viking Age in Great Britain. There were 100 times more axes being used in Great Britain at the time for chopping wood, for making boats, for general work and labour, in every single hamlet, in every village, in every hundred and cantrev on the island. We've got what? 150 swords? How many more swords were there? How many more men could afford a sword? How many more women could afford a sword? We don't know. This is the problem with survivorship bias. If we say that axes were more common and more frequently used than swords, we can't just use the data where we're from, or you could come back to me and say, oh, well, that might have been the case in England, but clearly it wasn't the case in Norway, where we've got 2,500 swords. It almost certainly was, because I can guarantee you more people owned an axe than owned a sword. And this is part of the problem. We say the Vikings preferred axes to swords, when what we mean is axes were much more commonly available than swords, and would probably have been, therefore, a much more common sight on the battlefield, because the majority of people fighting in the period will have been your common man who's just picked up whatever weapon he's got, which in most cases would be an axe. Your free common men would have been expected to own a weapon, and the easiest weapon you can own is a spear. The next easiest weapon you can own is an axe. A spear is a length of wood with a little bit of metal on the end. An axe is a lump of wood with a slightly larger piece of metal on the end. If you've already got an axe around the house, you take that with you, and you've got your weapon sorted, ready. Fantastic. If you can also afford a spear, or your local noble lord can provide you with a spear, as well as your axe and your shield, all the better. So, spears were probably the ubiquitous weapon. They have been effectively throughout human history. A spear is a very good thing to have. It keeps people further away from you than an axe or a sword. They're cheap, they're mass-producible, very easily made, and all of the period documents and illustrations we have show spears really as the universal weapon. You know, you look at Carolingian manuscripts, Saxon manuscripts, Norman stuff, they all show spears everywhere. Everybody has spears. Even the big Byzantine mosaics where you've got Varangians and the Barangioi are famed for using axes, certainly later on, there are still spears. Like, spears are everywhere. But it makes sense for axes to be the common weapon, right? Like we just discussed, everybody's got access to an axe. An axe does the job, it counts as a weapon, and we have depictions of people using axes as weapons. The Bayeux tapestry has the big 11th century broadaxe being used by knights, by armoured men, as a valid battlefield weapon for a nobleman, which it very much becomes in the high medieval period. We have things like the Middleton stone from Yorkshire, where we've got a fully armed man. He's got a sword and an axe and a spear and a fighting knife. And the fighting knife is also probably going to be quite a common weapon as a backup weapon. So rather than framing it as the Vikings preferred axes to swords, it might actually be better to say the axe was a very common weapon. It's not as sexy, it's not as clickbaity, obviously, but it might be more accurate to say the axe may have been more common than the sword on the battlefield, because 90% of people had access to an axe, and only those who could afford one would have bought or have had a sword. Maybe if you have a very wealthy lord or a king or a local nobleman, he will give you a sword as a gift. That's a very precious gift to have. It's a hell of a status symbol. We know that swords are cool. We love swords. I love swords. I've got a sword. I've also got an axe. Frankly, I kind of prefer my axe to my sword at this point. More on that at some other point. But there's this reenactorism, I think, where we have a tendency to enjoy navel gazing as reenactors. There's a lot of navel gazing. There's a lot of concentration on things like Jan Pedersen's typology and Mortimer Wheeler's typology from 1919 and 1927 of axe types and sword types, sword hilt types. Like the number of conversations people have at reenactment events about what hilt type they're going for with their sword is just astonishing. And people will do the same thing till the cows come home with axe typologies. We love a typology. We love taxonomy. We love it. As a species, we love to define things and label things. But I think that kind of rivet counting of typology really kind of misses the bigger picture of, yeah, we found hundreds of these axes. How many of those are specifically weapons? How many of those are specifically axes that have been used in battle, and how many of them are tool axes that were never used in battle? How many of them were tool axes that were taken for combat use? We don't know. We can never know. So, once again, there's nuance. We love a bit of nuance. The other thing is throwing axes, and obviously axe throwing has become a really popular thing, and the advertising for it is almost always Viking-based. I know of no evidence of throwing axes from the Viking Age. If you are one of those common men who comes to battle with his axe that is also the way he stops his family freezing to death, why would you throw it away? Why would you do that? Why would you throw the only thing you have that you can use to kill the enemy away? Maybe you've got a knife on your belt as well, but why would you throw away your primary weapon? That's such a dumb thing to do. And yes, we have Franciscas. Franciscas are from the 5th century into the 6th. They are definitively not Viking Age. So in terms of throwing axes, they're not really worth a mention in the video because, like, there's no evidence for them. But, you know, go axe throwing. It's fun. Have a couple of pints. Be safe. In terms of the broad axe, the Dane axe develops at the end of the 10th into the 11th century. And like I say, by the end of the 11th century, it is a weapon of status. Like, you can be a nobleman carrying a double-handed axe, and it's not seen as a shameful thing. Will you also own a sword? Almost certainly the sword is still an officer's weapon. You know, there's a reason carrying a sword was a gentlemanly thing to do right up into the 20th century. But that doesn't mean the sword loses status. It means that the axe gains status, right? You see things like the coat of arms of Norway, I believe, is a lion, a golden lion holding an axe. So clearly the axe is very much okay to have as a symbol, as a weapon of somebody with status. I wish I knew how many axes we had from Norway. That would be such useful information. I do apologise. But then you get other. So there's a weird axe-related reenactorism, which is this idea that in the English Civil Wars in the 1640s, soldiers were carrying swords as sidearms. They were carrying their tuck, their sword. And there's this old reenactors thing where they would say, oh yeah, they could only use those for chopping wood, couldn't they? They were no good as a weapon. If your sword is sharp enough for you to chop firewood with it, I'm pretty sure it's usable as a weapon. Like, I'm pretty sure. And also, like, if you have, as a musketeer, this is always the thing, musketeers would rather use their muskets as clubs than use their swords. Cool, so you've got this fairly fragile, quite expensive firearm in your hands, and your option is use the bar of metal designed for killing to hit people over the head, or try to use your fragile, delicate piece of high-tech firearms equipment as a club. Yeah, not convinced. Also, as if every hamlet and village didn't have plenty of wood axes that you could use to chop firewood, and also as if your baggage train didn't have axes. How do you think armies worked on campaign? That's not how they worked. So this is like it's a weird one, this one, I think, because axes were undoubtedly, there's no argument against them being extremely common, and they still are extremely common. I've got at least 3 in my shed. But did they prefer axes to swords? Or could more people afford axes than swords? And if you got the chance to have a sword, I'm pretty sure you'd take one. That's the angle I'm going with. That's the conclusion I'm going to go with, is more people had axes, but swords were also very common. We certainly know that. We've got hundreds, we've got thousands of Viking Age swords. And that's not even all of them, obviously. We've got survivorship bias to take into account, you know? This might be 90% of the swords that were made in the time, this might be 10% of the swords that were made in the time. The axes that we've got are probably less than 1% of the axes made in the time. So, we don't know is the answer. As it always is in my videos. Are you getting bored of me saying we don't know yet? Because it is true, it's probably the most, like, one comment said that we don't know is probably the most intellectually honest statement you can make, and I'm just going to keep making it, because we don't know. Did the Vikings prefer axes to swords? We don't know. They named their axes. Big deal. They named their swords as well. They named their kids, for that matter. So, diolch yn fawr iawn am ymuno. Thank you very much for joining. Diolch yn wylio. Thank you for watching. And I really hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed this little toe dipped into the murky waters of weapons. If you want me to do some more weapons videos or some more in-depth weapons videos, let me know in the comments what you'd like. Let me know what sort of information you want. That's a wasp. If you want me to steal the cat, let me know. And as ever, thank you to my wonderful patrons, to my coffee donors. If you want to support the channel financially, the details are all in the description. There's also some reading in the description that I'm trying to put into every video like this that I do. So I really hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much. And tan tro nesa, hwyl fawr. Till the next time. Bye bye. You're an adorable little weirdo. My friend.